Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Question, comment, answers especially welcome. Put it really close to your mouth if you don't mind.
Will you explain how going back to getting rid of civilization raises the temperature?
If you have time, I would recommend going on YouTube and finding a 58, 59-minute film put out by the BBC in 2005 on global dimming. We all know that we produce greenhouse gases through industrial activity. We burn fossil fuels. That puts greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, most notably carbon dioxide. The most abundant one is water vapor. At the same time, burning those fossil fuels, especially burning coal, and especially burning, quote, unclean coal. Clean coal is just coal that doesn't have very much sulfur in it. Unclean coal, the majority of coal, has a bunch of sulfur in it. And when you burn that coal, you put sulfates into the atmosphere. And those sulfates act as little mirrors that reflect incoming sunlight back into space. So those little mirrors, those little molecules called sulfates, are up there in the upper atmosphere, and they don't allow the sunlight to even get in to warm the planet so that the greenhouse gases can act as a blanket and hold that heat close to the planet. The sunlight never gets in. That's global dimming. And almost nobody knows anything about it because no climate scientist will talk about it. As nearly as I can tell, it's the most important and understudied phenomenon in the entire history of the subject of global climate change. Michael Mann knows about it. He did an interview a couple of years ago with Tom Hartman on Tom Hartman's television show on RT. And when it got to the solution part of the show, as it always does, Tom Hartman asked Dr. Mann, okay, what do we do? You're painting a very dire picture for us. Michael Mann is the hockey stick guy. You're painting a very dire picture for us. What do we do? And Michael Mann, the first thing he says is we keep burning coal. We can't stop burning coal. This is a leading climate scientist in the world. And he says we can't stop burning coal because he knows about global dimming. He knows if we stop burning coal, that within about 6 weeks, all those sulfates fall out of the sky, and the temperature heats up faster than it has ever in the history of the planet, at least in the last 2 billion years. So it's a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's the ultimate catch-22. We can't keep burning fossil fuels. It's going to kill us all. If we stop, it kills us even faster. Which trigger are you going to pull? So those sulfates, or aerosols, in fact, instead of being called global dimming, more recently the scientific community has been referring to this process as the aerosol masking effect. Because these aerosols that we burn with mostly coal and other fossil fuels, but mostly coal, these aerosols, notably sulfates, are put up into the atmosphere and they mask what would otherwise be a more rapid rise in global average temperature. So they mask the actual temperature that we would be at from burning fossil fuels. So it's horrible. It's horrible, and I suspect that's why most people won't talk about it. Because it really does point to there being no solution. We all want solutions. We all want to take those courageous acts that will make the planet a better place for our grandchildren than when we showed up. But what if there is no such act? I left active service at the University of Arizona in May of 2009. I was among the most award-winning professors in the history of that institution, and I left voluntarily at the age of 49 because I thought, and every time I say it, it makes me laugh, and everybody in the crowd too, so I have to sort of brace myself. I thought, here I am, a very successful professor, enjoying a life of enormous privilege, making a lot of money for not doing much work. And I'm going to leave to set an example, and everybody's going to follow along behind me and abandon civilization, because civilization is bad. You're free to laugh out loud now, and we'll take a short break. The audacity to think I had that sort of influence over anybody is staggering. Yeah, I'm going to quit my job, and everybody else is too, because clearly it's the right thing to do. Civilization is a heat engine that's driving to extinction 150 to 200 species a day. We don't want to do that, so let's just drop out. Let's just all of us go live off-grid and grow our own food. And so I did that. I started this project, I could barely distinguish between a screwdriver and a zucchini, and next thing you know, I'm growing a bunch of food, enough for me and 4 other people, and learning how to build structures and milking goats. I milked goats. I became a master cheesemaker. I'm a professor, for crying out loud. And I just thought that if I do this, that everybody else would follow along. Well, it's a good thing nobody did. Because if everybody else had abandoned civilization when I did, the aerosol masking effect would come into play. We wouldn't be having this conversation, I'll tell you that. That was 9.5 years ago. We'd all be dead by now. So it's a good thing nobody paid me any attention, which wasn't the mentality I had in my classrooms, by the way, when I thought I was pretty darn special. Thank you for that question. So Kurt wants me to give a 3-semester course in Arctic dynamics in 30 seconds. That'll be easy. As I indicated, the Arctic is the planet's air conditioner. And that comes primarily from 3 different factors, any one of which causes our extinction. There are 3 things going on at the same time. If we lose the Arctic ice, as the president of Finland has been saying for nearly a year, then we lose habitat for humans. Why? Why is that? One, there's a lot of albedo or reflectance from the white ice. We get rid of the white ice, we're not reflecting in that light back up in the summer in the northern hemisphere. It's soaking into the blue ocean because of the absence of albedo, the absence of reflectance. That's a lot of heat being poured into an already overheated ocean. That's one factor. Second factor, it's called latent heat. You've been to a party, I'm sure all of you. This doesn't apply to me, but I'm sure you've all been to a party. And you get to a party and you fill up a glass with ice, but it's really not full, because then you fill it again with liquid. And so it's maybe half ice and half liquid, and you walk around at the party, and for an hour or 2, the temperature of the liquid in that glass is right about freezing. It's somewhere between 0 and 1 degree Celsius. It's nearly freezing. As long as there's a little tiny sliver of ice, the tiniest bit, it's 0 degrees, maybe 1 degree Celsius. The instant the last little sliver of ice disappears, the 79.2 calories of energy that went into melting a gram of ice and turning it into a milliliter of water, that 79.2 calories heats up that milliliter of water 79.2 degrees Celsius. Scalding hot. Scalding hot. Phase change matters. Latent heat matters. A little bit of ice goes a really long way. So the instant the ice disappears in your glass, 20 minutes later it's room temperature. You've been carrying it for an hour, hour and a half. It's been freezing, right at freezing. And that last little bit of ice goes away, and now it's at room temperature, and it's not very much fun to drink the brew anymore. So that's the second factor, latent heat. And the third is methane clathrates, or hydrates. And these are chemical cages surrounding methane, ice cages or lattices surrounding methane in the relatively shallow seabed of the Arctic Ocean. And there's billions of tons of the stuff. And according to Arctic ice researcher Natalia Shukova and her research team, dating back to late 2008, or nearly a decade ago, that research team at the European Geophysical Union annual meeting indicated that a 50 gigaton release of these hydrates was highly possible at any time. It's been almost 10 years that such a release has been highly possible for abrupt release at any time. Certainly if we get rid of all the ice, the temperature of the ocean water will warm up enough to release that first 50 gigaton burst and a whole bunch more, and cause methane to be released into the atmosphere at an ever-increasing rate. Methane is more than 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, molecule for molecule. It's a big, big deal. Every molecule of methane is worth at least 100 molecules of carbon dioxide in terms of planetary warming. So those are three major factors associated with the ice in the Arctic that could, in the near term, contribute to our demise as a species in the very short term. We lose the Arctic ice, we lose the globe. Period. And we don't persist without habitat. Just like every other species on the planet, we need the place that provides our food and our water and our air. We just don't get along without those things, clever though we may be. Somebody else? Hold it really close, please.
So going back to aerosol masking or global dimming, what do you know about chemtrails?
There was a researcher who on September 14th, 2001, 3 days after 9/11, considered the idea that contrails, condensation trails behind jet aircraft, might be responsible for cooling the temperature of the planet. And so he made some observations and discovered that indeed the temperature signature of the Earth changed very rapidly between September 11th and September 14th, when US commercial aircraft were grounded for those 3 days. That was really the only thing of significance that happened. I have written a little bit about geoengineering and notably included the notion of chemtrails in a pretty lengthy essay from a couple of years ago. And I concluded that there is no evidence that I can uncover, and certainly none in the referee journal literature, for the idea of purposefully spraying chemicals from airplanes into the environment. So that's my take. I can't find any evidence to support the idea of chemtrails.
But it's done. Why are they doing it? By air shows and things.
So contrails are real. Chemtrails, the purposeful pouring of aluminum and strontium and other heavy metals into the atmosphere, I don't see any evidence for that. That's my point.
And why are they doing it?
You ask why are they doing it? I don't think there's a they, and I don't think they, whoever they are doing it. I've read a lot about them, whoever they are, trying to kill us with chemtrails and then trying to save us with chemtrails. But I see no evidence, particularly in the referee journal literature, the gold standard of science, for there being any purposeful attempt to introduce heavy metals into the atmosphere. That said, burning coal produces a lot of heavy metals. So strictly by burning fossil fuels, we produce a lot of those heavy metals, and they fall out of the sky and they land in the waters and on the land and so on. So that's what I think about they and doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, previous to the last,
Hold it real close, please.
previous to the last ice age, wasn't there a huge amount of volcanic activity that covered the Earth and caused the temperature to drop? And I guess what I'm saying is, what if that were to happen again?
Right, and in fact, it's been proposed by otherwise self-respecting scientists that we throw some hydrogen bombs into volcanoes, just for the hell of it. Because there's nothing like a good volcano to cool the Earth. And in fact, Pinatubo is the latest example from what, 1987, I think? Pinatubo was a big earthquake that stabilized the global average temperature, but then did what all the studies on solar radiation management have indicated would happen. So the temperature, the global average temperature is going like this. There's stabilization And then there's not just returning to the initial curve, this curve actually steepens. So the temperature incline is going like this, it stabilizes, and then it goes up even steeper. And abundant evidence on solar radiation management summarized by the United States National Academy of Sciences in that 2015 report I pointed to, and also by a European body of similar stature, indicates that solar radiation management in the form of volcanoes or whatever won't help, and probably will make matters worse. So it might stabilize the temperature very briefly, but are we going to do that repeatedly? Are we going to bomb Yellowstone and Pinatubo and the Cascades and on and on and on forever? I mean, the whole reason we're in this mess is because we're humans doing. Not because we're human beings, because we're humans doing. You want to do more? Because what we've done so far has worked out great. So I think that would be very similar to solar radiation management, and I suspect that's why there has been no funded research effort on behalf of corporations or the government to do something like that. There is the occasional interesting scientist like David Keith at Harvard who proposes spraying the skies over Arizona. But as nearly as I can tell, that violates international law. Not that the United States has been particularly attached to international law for a long while, mind you. And so it would require some sort of rogue effort outside of sort of standard channels with respect to governments and corporations. And even then, it appears it wouldn't work, or I suspect we'd be doing that right now. I suspect somebody in the United States government will be telling us that what we have to do is blow up volcanoes and otherwise increase the reflectance or the albedo up in space. And so we're going to start doing something like that. But I haven't seen anything to that effect. Maybe I missed the memo or the press release. But I don't see that happening. And I suspect that's because you go back to the very conservative process implemented by the National Academy of Sciences and indicates that it's not going to work. That's my guess. Hold it real close, please.
You say you're not a proponent of inaction?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
I am not clear about what actions you are laying out for us that we could do to even help slow this process, even though it's inevitable that it will happen.
I think that there's nothing to be done. My point is that I'm not opposed to action at the level of individual, family, community, society, culture, if there's some indication that that action would improve the situation. I'm not a fan of, quote, rolling over and dying, as I'm frequently accused of doing. I just don't see what the action is. Is it terminating civilization, which is what I believed at one point, and then we learned about global dimming through the standard protocols of the scientific endeavor, and then it turned out that would have been a really bad idea, so it's a good thing nobody followed my lead. So with limited evidence, I thought that, civilization is a bad thing, we need to turn off the switch. But then we find out later that that would be a really bad idea, because then the switch would be turned off for all of us in the not too distant future in terms of habitat. So I don't know what the action is. I'm not opposed to action rooted in evidence that might improve the situation. That's all. I don't know what that action is. A follow-up question is always so dangerous, really. Are you sure?
Yeah, I can do it.
No, I'm not afraid for you. I'm afraid for me.
Yeah, well, me too. It's a comment, and that is that human beings are fundamentally wired for survival. Most of us will, against overwhelming odds, pursue survival. And what you're sketching is kind of like global massive depression, which even with your encouragement to live well and love and all that, I think there's an incongruity with a really healthy living with what you're sketching out.
Point taken. I'm a bummer. And I think we're in hospice. I think that there's no way out. I'm open to the idea, and if I see evidence indicating that there is a way out, whether it's squirrely light bulbs or abandoning civilization, I'm a fan. I've made sacrifices that nobody in this room can even possibly imagine. I gave up every relationship in my life. I gave up a really, really high rate of pay for doing nothing. I lost behind every relationship. I'm willing to do anything, clearly, to try to fix the situation. I just don't see what the fix is. I'm routinely badmouthed for telling people to roll over and die, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm suggesting that you might live with a little urgency, that your time is short, that any moment might be your last.
And is that what you would tell your children and grandchildren?
If I had children or grandchildren? Well, I wouldn't tell them, look, 4-year-old grandson, this is a pistol.
I know.
Yes, I would tell my children and my grandchildren the same thing I'm telling you. Life is short. If you can find it on YouTube, there's a wonderful 59-second commercial for Xbox. You know, one of these video game things, I guess. I don't know what it is. And it's life is short. If you go to YouTube and type in the search box, life is short, banned Xbox commercial, you'll get this amazing 58 or 59-second video that indicates how short life really is. You know, in March of 2015, which I know goes back a while, the world's oldest human being at the time turned 117 years old. And when asked to ponder the first 117 years of her life at her 117th birthday party, she said, and I quote, "It seemed rather short." She was 117. It seemed rather short. It will for you too. It will for me too. I'm not ready to die. I think it's a terrible idea. But I know it will be short no matter when it happens. I can't imagine, as I'm drawing my last breaths, and I know they are my last breaths, I can't imagine I'll be thinking, well, I had a good run. 60 years, whatever. Good enough. No. I think all of us will have regrets because we didn't live with urgency, because we didn't complete relationships, because we have a bad taste in our mouth about something we didn't do or we did do to somebody. I think all of us will experience those kinds of things. I don't think any of us are going to say, whew, glad that's over. Geez, look at that, I'm 59. Finally get out of this rat race. No, not at all. So if I had children or grandchildren, and you know, for 21 years in university life, I stood in front of people who were between the ages of 18 and 22 for the most part, and sometimes even older than I was, if you can possibly imagine that. So they were young people, and I was encouraging them to live with urgency even then. And I was teaching my classes in a way that university administrators found appalling, because I was having students take over the learning process for themselves. I was exhibiting and practicing classroom anarchism, which just means to take responsibility for yourself and for those around you. So yes, in fact, I routinely speak to people I would consider young. A recent example comes in Wales when I was speaking to 16 to 22-year-olds, and I gave them the general story that I gave you, at the end of which there was this feeling of great liberation, and 16 to 22-year-olds were skipping across the presentation hall because they knew they'd been lied to their entire lives. They knew that we fucked the planet and there's nothing to be done about it. And I'm encouraging them to live fully in light of that knowledge. And they appreciated it. Almost nobody appreciates being told that they're in stage 4 cancer and that they're going to die. But if it's the truth, generally the patient comes to grips with that knowledge. Not always, but generally. When presented the evidence, the patient realizes, it was probably the best thing you could have told me. Yes?
I'll present a slightly different perspective, as many
Imagine
of you
that.
can imagine. I agree that the recent papers on aerosol masking are pretty depressing. I think there's no doubt about that. They suggest, as Guy described, that we're seeing about 50% less of the global warming than we would have predicted from the greenhouse gases emitted from fossil fuels. So basically that atmosphere or the aerosol masking from the sulfates reduced by half the damage that we would have expected. And some of those papers also suggest that if we all of a sudden removed all the sulfates in particular, overall, the 1 degree Celsius Guy mentioned, I don't think you mentioned the 4 degrees increase in the Arctic, which is even more frightening if you want to look at that. But
I don't want to depress people.
Suggests to me is not that we have to give up at all, but that there are lots of ways of increasing reflectance, of basically not allowing too much heat to continue to be absorbed. And so there are lots of things. The predictions used to be we had to increase albedo effect by 0.5%. And those are 1988 figures. They don't deal with the atmospheric or the aerosol masking. So I think those numbers need to be increased pretty dramatically. There's a lot of work going on right now. For example, we've seen ecological changes, landscape changes in, say, the taiga, so north of the far, the subarctic regions, where for just reasons of people being pushed off the land, say, we have far fewer large animals. So muskoxen, the caribou that many of you know I work on right now, the great Pleistocene megafauna, many of which went extinct. And their grazing used to prevent the growth of shrubs and increase, and make sure there were lots of grasses. And it turns out those grasses are shiny, and they have a really high albedo effect. So we're losing polar ice, Arctic ice, which sucks if we want to keep the albedo effect high. But we have lots of potential right now for reversing some of these positive feedback cycles, these runaway warming cycles, by basically doing smart, creative things to increase the amount of reflectance. I used to be pretty hostile towards geoengineering. I'm beginning to think, well, the downsides of not geoengineering may be pretty dramatic. So I'm very positive about certain kinds of geoengineering, so-called natural geoengineering, to grab carbon, to sequester carbon, and to do what we can to increase albedo effect. I'm pretty dubious about certain experiments like that dump a bunch of iron oxide off the Pacific, which creates big algal blooms, and then they grab carbon and then they die and sink. And the hope was that would sequester carbon. There's some downsides to that, basically red tides that kill a lot of, or potential for problematic algae. So I guess what I am not yet at the point where Guy is. I do find the atmospheric stuff a little, or the aerosol stuff a little scary, but I think there are lots of things we could do still to basically reflect a lot of this stuff back up into the solar system. And so we disagree on whether or not there's hope. It's harder than we thought it would be. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not at all ready yet to give up on hope because I love my musk oxen and caribou. More caribou. Everybody say more caribou.
Thus my answer to the first question, which, if you recall, is where you're not proposing inaction. I'm not proposing inaction because I would get accused, as I just was, of giving up. It was embedded within your comment, which wasn't a question, that I said we'd give up, that I have no hope and we should give up. That's the implication of your comment. I have never suggested such a thing.
I wasn't saying you were giving up. I was saying that I think we can indeed manipulate the albedo effect. This national meeting.
In any event. In any event, there are a lot of things that potentially we could do. None of them are being done. I think there's a reason for that. People other than me think they won't work.
You know, there's the science is all very good, and I've learned a lot, and it's interesting to see all the different perspectives here. It sounds to me like it comes down to how do humans make meaning of their lives, given whatever it is. When my mother was dying from congestive heart failure, she made meaning of her life in a certain way, and in that particular case it involved religion. I wasn't about to condemn her for that. She took action in her own particular way. And people have been doing that all along. I mean, Sam Keen, who wrote many times ago, said, we're not a biologic creature, we're a biomythic creature. So the stories that we tell ourselves can be things that are whatever we need to tell ourselves to get through the day. And that's how I managed to work for 30 years. I tried to be as realistic as possible, recognizing that I can't possibly know everything. I can't possibly know all the consequences of every action. I can only do what I can do in a moment. But apart from that, this other subject, which is not really a science, and is probably not even within your area, but I wonder if you know anything about, if all of this becomes true, and as things heat up or as they flare up, how are we going to deal with the social impacts, not just the science impacts? Is anybody looking at what dynamics will happen as the Earth heats up? They're going to be political, economic, social, structural aspects, and how do we model those possible behaviors? And I think in that particular case, there are actions that we can take that may make a difference.
Yes, that's a fine question. There's a guy named Jim Bendell, J-E-M Bendell, who just last week released an occasional paper from his university. Actually, the university released a paper on his behalf. And they released it as an occasional paper because he submitted it as a refereed journal article, and all of the reviewers who were anonymous, they were not revealed, said there's nothing wrong with this science, but he's just a bummer. Collapse will produce sociological impacts that according to all the evidence will be depressing. Therefore, this paper should not be published. This is insane. We cannot predict the future at that level. We get to create the future for ourselves and the relatively few people around us. We don't know what the future looks like in detail. Let's say civilization stops tonight. Tonight at midnight, the lights go out all over the planet. And there's no fuel at the filling station, no food at the grocery stores, no water coming out of the municipal taps, just all of a sudden we stop. Do you know how everybody's going to respond? I don't. I think compassionate people will be even more compassionate than they were before. I think sociopaths will take advantage to greater effect than they already do. But I don't know. So I try to create a life of meaning for the few people I have influence over. Because I don't know. There are things we don't know. But I get to create the future to a certain extent, to the very limited extent that I have free will and all those other things. But we do get to choose every day who we annoy or not, what we do on a day-to-day basis. That's why I'm a huge fan of Buddhism as a philosophy, not a religion, including taking right action, including the Eightfold Way and the Four Noble Truths. And particularly with respect to not being attached to the outcome. For 21 years, every single course I taught at 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5, maybe 7 different universities, every single course I taught, I pointed out that no problem of significance can be improved by adding more people to the planet. Every single course for 21 years. And as nearly as I can tell, every single one of my students had children. Every one. Were I attached to the outcome? I'd have been a mess, to say the least. If I were to attach the outcome of my students having children, it would have made me even crazier than I am. So, right action, don't be attached to the outcome. The world's a mess. The world is so much worse than it was when I got here. It wasn't all my fault, but it's the culture I was born into, and so it was partially my fault because I didn't throw away the bars that reinforced my cave that were the expectations of others. It's a grim-looking future. I'm not proposing inaction for the 1000th time. I'm proposing that the actions you take will have relatively minor impact, except to the relatively few people that you have some sort of influence or control over, which is not very many, and that you don't be too attached to the outcome. I talk to people all the time who are very concerned that their children are having children. All of my children, all of my students in university life went out and had children. I think every single one of them. Even though I pointed out the horrors of more people on the planet. We got more than twice as many people as we did on February 29th, 1960 when I came on board. I'm not attached to the outcome. I think we should take right action. I think that's all we need to know. Stephen Jenkinson is an Eastern Canadian who has worked in what he calls the death trade for his entire adult life. And his book is called Die Wise, and it acknowledges that we all die. He tells a great story in documentary films made about him, in his books, in his public presentations, of the chief medical officer involved in a particular case. Okay, so we have a terminal patient, and we have a medical team that always included Stephen Jenkinson, and a doctor and a couple of nurses and whatever, I don't know. And every single time, the lead medical doctor says, "Is it time to sedate?" Meaning, of course, is it time to sedate the patient, remove their pain, but also remove their ability, or at least reduce their ability to perceive what's going on around them. Do we sedate? And every single time for more than 21 years, Stephen Jenkinson, yes, we need to sedate the family and friends. Not the patient. They know what's happening. The ones in denial are the family and friends. The dying patient knows they're dying. That's where we're at. As a society, that's where we're at. We refuse to even have the conversation. Instead, we propose sedation. Soma. Television.
I've hesitated to ask this question because it is kind of a bummer. About 25 years ago, Bill Moyers had a series of interviews on public television, and he interviewed poets and scientists and politicians, and one of them was an environmental scientist. And she said that at that time, 25, 30 years ago, we were experiencing then the results of the pollution from 30 years before that. And so I would be interested in hearing if you know about that, and is that what's happening now? We're experiencing what has the terrible things we've been doing from 30 years ago, and we haven't even experienced what we've done now?
At some level, yes, absolutely. In fact, there's a 10-year lag between emission of carbon dioxide molecules and the maximum heating associated with those molecules. So we have yet to experience the maximum heating associated with the emissions you produce by driving your car here, that we produce by turning on the lights and the projector. We're 10 years away from that. With respect to every other aspect of the environmental contamination we're pursuing with great glee, it's undoubtedly worse on many fronts. Plastic in the ocean? Of course, everything is worse than I've told you. I'm the ultimate optimist. I'm Mr. Silver Lining. One more question.
say that, well, first of all, let me tell you that I'm 91 years old. So I have a different perspective from a lot of the people that are here, who I'm sure are thinking about their, you know, what their grandmothers and they're talking about their grandmothers dying and older people. I came tonight to hear your perspective because you were advertised as an expert on global warming, and I certainly found that to be true. And I just want to say that I feel encouraged because number one, like you say, we all knew from the time we were 12 or whatever that we're all going to die. We've always known that. And I think if we're paying attention, we know that we're on a hurry-up path to it for all of us if we continue what we're doing with the planet. But what I didn't expect tonight was the last few minutes of your talk about, I can't even remember what you said verbatim, but it was like getting along, you know. I have a shirt on tonight that my friend Dorothy gave me, and it says, what does it say? Be kind, choose joy, work for peace. I mean, and then you're talking about what the influence we have with the people around us. I think that's one of the major things we can do is to do the opposite of what I find our government doing, frankly, being along with our neighbors, enjoying our lives, doing good wherever we can, because we don't know who, I mean, we are an aging community and we're having deaths here all the time, you know. None of us knows how much time we have. But I thank you for your encouraging words.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming again. I'll stay here and chat with you individually as long as you want.